Okay, welcome everyone. I'm going to talk to you about brains and balance. There's been a lot of talk about balance control, and I thought I should share with you some of our work on balance and control and things to think about in control of balance. So I'm going to try to advance my slides. Just a background on me. I know we've done this before, but in my lab, we're really interested in fundamental science and engineering principles to understand mobility disorders in a very personalized way. And our work ranges from sort of basic physiology underlying motor control, focused especially on balance control and on individual differences across those behaviors, developing these sort of what I call physiologically interpretable analyses, and then using those to look at those impairments in various populations. Aging, stroke, and Parkinson's disease are our current sort of populations of study, and then sort of thinking about how did we translate those findings into rehabilitation, assessments, training, devices, and things like that. So I use balance control because we can identify a lot of principles that have generalized to walking, but we can do a lot more there. But when we are talking about balance control, so let me just say, why is balance control important? When I was a grad student, I was definitely interested in locomotion, and there were people in the lab studying balance control, and I thought, like, this is not even like a motor behavior. Like, the whole point is that nothing moves. And it turns out that it's really complex and involves all parts of your nervous system. Balance control is fundamental to all voluntary movements, or balance control and postural control, let's say. Babies need to be able to stand before they can walk, and if they lose that ability, then they can't do all of the other things we want to do with our body. And in people over 65, falls are a really large cause of what we call morbidity and mortality. So that means like some kind of injury that impairs you, that where you lose your independence, mobility, quality of life, and that might cause sort of a negative spiral that causes people's health to overall degenerate. So one of the things about balance control is it's impaired in almost any kind of disorder you can think of, ranging from musculoskeletal to neurological, psychological, psychiatric as well. And that's because it really involves all the parts of the body. So sensory systems, motor systems, and as we'll talk about, the cognitive systems as well. And one of the things you should know about balance is that another indication of balance impairments in especially older adults and in patients in hospitals is medication. So medications can cause a lot of drowsiness and attentiveness and other factors that will cause people to act in ways that will put them at high risk for falls. So today, so balance control, I want to say, is like it's what we call an automatic behavior, a lot like breathing. You can control it from many different neural circuits. So just painted like a spinal cord, a brain, and we have what we call subcortical structures and cortical structures. And so normally, just like in breathing, you don't think about it. So that means this sort of part of your brain, the spinal cord and the sort of brainstem, sort of subcortical areas are used to control that behavior. And so that's sort of indicated by the fact that you could like walk and text and when you're young, and like you can still do all these things without thinking about it, right? But in certain circumstances, that control of balance or walking or breathing could shift to higher levels in the brain, which we call cortical circuits, where you're more aware of what's going on and controlling things in a more voluntary way. And so this is a natural sort of flexible behavior that happens as we move in challenging environments, doing a more difficult type of task. And then in aging or other diseases, it might be that because of loss of all of these functions I'll tell you about, neural, sensory, motor, that people might be just sort of more on the right side of this continuum all the time. So they're engaging their cortical circuits for things that are maybe more automatic in people without those impairments. And before I continue, I want to encourage you to ask questions as I go along, because things will build from here, and it's more fun. So in our lab, the way that we look at balance control, in a scientific way, is to have this moving platform. We instrument people with motion capture, EMG, and now EEG, which is measuring electrical signals from the brain. And that allows us to have very well-controlled conditions in which we can kind of look at the neuromuscular control of balance. Whoops. And so one of the fundamental principles is that, there's a hierarchical system of neural control, which actually makes it very difficult to understand what's going on in balance and where the deficits are. So if we were to, we literally pull the rug out from under people's feet, that causes a lot of sensory information to be generated. Those signals can go through multiple pathways. I've painted 3 here. The spinal cord, there should be about 50 for people. Brainstem, which takes about twice as long for the signals to travel up and come back down to the muscle, and then into areas of your brain. And we can make recordings at the output in the muscles. So this is muscle activity over time, and the perturbation starts, the floor starts to slip this dotted line, and we see a response at about 100 milliseconds, which is brainstem mediated, and I'll tell you a little bit later about the difference between these different layers. And then we can now measure stuff in the brain that happens at about the same time. So signals are going up, splitting, one's coming down, one's going to the brain, and they all converge upon the muscle output. So the output that we see is a sum of all of these different types of behavior loops of processing, and I'll talk about how this brain signal might be driving later parts of the muscle activity. Okay, so some take-home messages that I have is you need all of your senses for balance. There are many different neural and muscular strategies for balance. And then the brain activity for balance increases in aging and many diseases, so balance becomes less automatic. And it turns out because you're using these parts of your brain that aren't usually used for movement, balance health is related to cognitive health. And I'll show you that individual differences in the brain activity that we see may help us quantify this sort of differences in balance health before people begin to fall. This is the outline of the talk. Balance control requires coordination across all levels of the nervous system. I'll talk about the sensory inputs, coordinating muscles, brain activity, and then this cognitive interactions. And on the right is sort of the picture that I think of is that we have a level of what I call execution level control, things that we can measure, like muscles activity, movements of the body, pressure on the feet. Those things, the sensory information that we get is sort of has to be interpreted by the brain, and then as to which way you're falling, and then you have to figure out, okay, what muscles do I activate? These processes are very multifaceted, and that makes it really hard to study and interesting to study at the same time. So for balance control, we need multiple senses. And some of the things, some definitions I want to give in balance control is, okay, what do you need to know to maintain your balance? So first, you need to know which way is up. balance only is relevant because we live in a gravitational field, and so it's important to know which way that is. So that I would call like postural orientation. So am I aligned with the gravity vector or am I not? The second would be, am I falling? Like, am I in equilibrium or am I in disequilibrium? So this I would call balance. So this is, do I have forces so that I am stable in this gravitational field? And typically we talk about this in standing balance as being keeping my center of mass over the base of support. So when you're standing here, you know, it's the space between your feet. So you wanna, if your center of mass projection stays in it, generally people can stay upright. If it goes beyond it, okay, that's when you're going to start falling. You can do things like extend your base of support by taking a step or by holding onto something. It's just where are your points of contact with the environment that can support that. Okay, so that's different from what I would call posture. Posture or postural control has to do with my body configuration. So sometimes, so in the literature is very confusing on this. So often postural control and balance control are used interchangeably, but they're really not the same thing. So posture would be, I maintain a body configuration and I maintain the relative positions of body, and that's not always a good balance strategy. In fact, people with Parkinson's tend to be very rigid and their body's all aligned and you push them and then they fall like a tree and their posture is perfectly maintained and yet they're not in balance at all. So in order to do these things, it's really the relative motion and position of myself to the outside world. So that requires what we call exteroception, so sensing things in the environment. And then it also requires proprioception, which is sensing my own body and where it is relative to it, and then making a computation about how those two things are aligned. Question?
So can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So you talked about the multiple circuits involved in balance control, and the example you showed, it involved a brainstem level circuit showing up in the EMG. Do you ever see in some muscles short latency and long latency responses in the EMG?
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one other kind of general question, do you think that the circuits involved in balance control for standing are the same or fundamentally different from those in like walking?
They're the same.
Okay.
They're the same. We're doing balance studies, and even the principles are the same. I didn't put it here, and I meant to add a slide showing that, like, the center of mass control mechanism Friedel Digert has shown works to predict sort of corrective torques and perturbed walking as well. And we're also working on that right now with Kristen Jakubowski and Aaron Young. So it's just a really good way to figure it out in balance. Figuring it out in walking is very, very difficult.
Because there's so many things going on in walking all at once.
There's things going on, and so you don't know what's feed forward and what feedback, and it's hard to dissociate the torques that are for the gait pattern versus the correction.
Cool, thanks.
Sure. All right, so I'm gonna go through the senses, and actually I'm gonna ask you. So if I needed to find out these things, like, and I had vision, which of these questions would I be able to answer? Any ideas out there? So would I know which way is up? Would I know if I'm falling? And would I know what my posture is?
Any trainees want to venture some ideas?
This happens for the next 4 slides, so get ready.
Can you tell when you're falling?
Maybe. And which way is up? Maybe. Right, so that's going to depend on whether you have a good visual reference. So if you have a horizon or a tree or a wall and you trust it to be vertical, then that might help you know which way is up, and we use that quite a lot. You're falling may be my motion relative to that, but I could also have motion relative to that because I moved, right? And I certainly can't tell my posture unless I'm looking at my body. So the visual system, you can see motion of the world, and like it might cause a postural, like a balance response, right? So if you stand on a train platform and it's like your whole visual field and it moves, a lot of times you jump, right? That's a balance response, balance correcting response, because that vision gave you the illusion that you were falling, and that's because the visual system just tells you relative motion, and then you have to decide whether that means I'm moving or the world is moving. And since I didn't voluntarily move, it's like, oh, maybe something pushed me, right? And so you get that. So you can't tell the difference between my motion and the others, and it's also just in my eyes. So it's about where my eyes are, which could, relative to my body, could be very different, and I would need to know what muscles to activate. And without knowing where my eyes were relative to my body, I wouldn't be able to do that. You can also maintain your balance with your eyes closed. Okay, there's a vestibular system. Any guesses? Oh, look, see, I put the answers here because my slides are bad. But the vestibular system, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's often called the balance organ. It's a part of your inner ear. So can it tell you which way is up? Any guesses on that? Or which way you're falling? All right, we got a quiet group today, so I'll just keep going.
No, wait it out. Wait it out.
I could wait it out. We have more stuff to do.
Okay.
I can wait it out. I did that on Tuesday when I gave this lecture. But just to talk about the vestibular system a little bit, I know Victoria can tell you a lot more about it. There are fluid-filled canals that are in 3 planes, and so when that fluid moves, it means you're rotating. And there's also an otolith system here, which is basically, I like to think about lobsters when I talk about the vestibular system. They have, think about a ball with a bunch of hair cells on it and some rocks inside of it. So wherever the rock lands, you get a signal. And so that's going to tell me which way is up, but it's also going to move when I accelerate in different directions. So if I accelerate sideways or if I tilt my head down, basically get the same signal. So it can tell me something about which way is up, as long as I am not also accelerating. So you might get that tilting sensation when you're like in a car, in an amusement park ride, that type of a thing. And again, these are head-based sensors, so it doesn't tell you about your posture. It might tell you you're falling. I went snowboarding once in a whiteout, and I was like, I can't see which way is down. And I thought, Lena, you have a vestibular system. This should work. But the next thing I knew, I was like really close to the ground, and I had no idea. And that's because some of it takes a bit of higher frequency sort of motion to like activate the fluid moving in the canals. So it's there, but it's also not enough to control your balance. Okay, we also have this somatosensory system. So anyone have any guesses of like what these are sensors in the skin, cutaneous receptors? Could they help contribute to these questions of which way is up? Am I falling? What's my body configuration?
We can tell if we're falling because we can feel our center of pressure in our feet.
Yep. So there's a lot of these in the feet, and the sensation of the center of pressure in the feet is extremely important for balance control. So if you like cool your feet, it's hard to stand up. So there's a paper about the foot sole is a dynametric map of balance. Which way is up? Am I falling? Certainly not. It might give you some on body configuration. So there's evidence now that like skin stretch in my joints, around my joints, can provide some information about joint motion. Okay, let's see. Proprioceptors are very, very important for balance. So the proprioceptors are the other sixth sense. There's a competition. So muscle spindles are sort of modified muscles that are turned into sensory organs that fire typically when muscles are stretched. You also have Golgi tendon organs that are at the muscle tendon junction that respond to sort of any kind of tension on that piece of tendon. And together they give us a sense of kinesthesia and where our bodies are relative to each other. The muscle spindle is what's responsible for this knee-jerk response that you have at the doctor, where basically you hit the tendon, it stretches a little bit, causes firing in the muscle spindle, then it goes back to the spinal cord and causes that same muscle to contract. So it's like a little feedback control system. All right, so what do we think about proprioceptors? Can they tell us which way is up, if you're falling, or what your body configuration is?
Definitely if you're falling. I'll answer an easy one so then trainees can try some harder ones.
It what? I didn't get that.
I said definitely if you're falling.
It can tell you if you're falling,
Yeah.
and how.
I don't know. I mean, you'll feel the weight of you break from underneath you.
So that,
I guess.
yeah. So there's forces on your muscles, and you might not have it. So
Yeah.
you might feel the loss of sort of ground support, right? So that might
Or
be-
like if you're leaning, you would feel a stretch in certain muscles, right?
yes.
Yeah.
But so it might tell you that motion. It's sort of the most important at telling us what our body configuration is. So where's my head? How is my neck turned relative to the rest of my body, so that I know when I'm looking at something, if it's sliding that way, it's a forward backward, and if the same visual signal is here, it means left right. It can tell me which way it's up if I trust the horizon, if I trust the tree, if I trust the motion of the walls in the boat that I'm standing on, right? So that information may not be vertical. Great. Okay, so as I've gone through this, I think you can see that basically none of these senses can answer all of the questions I need to answer to maintain balance. And so just as an example of some of the ways in which your brain handles this is that it has to integrate multiple senses to balance. So as an example, you can you need to integrate vestibular and proprioceptive information. So this is a kind of experiment done by Bob Paterka and many others, where you stand on a moving surface, and in this case, unlike our lab, the platform tilts. Okay, so it's tilting, and they blindfold people so that they can't use vision, although there are some other interesting manipulations there. And so what you see is you look at how much the body sways relative to how much the platform tilts. Okay, so on the bottom axis, I have the platform tilting, the root mean square of the tilt, and on the y-axis, I have how much the body sways. And so basically, if you follow this black dotted line, it means there's a 1-to-1 correlation. So as much as the platform tilts, my body will tilt with it. Okay, so when you have a very small tilt, so this is 0.5 degrees, not very much, you can see that the body in fact does that. So this is pretty small amplitude. It might not get picked up by your vestibular system that much, or I might not see it even when I'm standing with my eyes open. And so which of the senses is sort of might be helping me maintain that tilt with respect to the ground? I can only see Skylar in my video, so calling him, but
It'd be great if trainees were willing to speak up. It's okay if you don't know the answer. You could make a guess.
I can talk up on this one.
Yeah.
I would say the vestibular system, and then at least the proprioceptive sensors in your feet can feel change of center of pressure.
so you could be the center pressure maybe, but it's probably, in this case, I'm gonna say proprioceptive, because what you do is you try to maintain your body's, the posture, right? So basically try to keep my ankle at a right angle to the floor. And it's not just my ankles, and I have to make sure my knees are straight, my hips are straight, everything is, so this thing here, I would call a postural strategy. And as long as I have this proprioceptive information, I can do that. And then what you can see is as the tilting gets larger, then it's not such a good strategy anymore, but you can see that people don't increase how much they tilt. So that means that I'm only swaying a little bit and the ground is tilting below me, right? So now my ankles go free and my head is reasonably stable to 0.5 degrees. And so that would be an indication that my vestibular system is kicking in and telling me like, hey, keep this gravity vector here, don't tilt my head like this. Okay, so then if you have people with vestibular loss, they don't have that signal anymore. And so what happens is as you increase the tilt of the platform, they just keep tilting with the ground. Okay, so you might need to use this kind of strategy, like this is like standing on a boat, right? One strategy is to just keep my orientation with the deck. And then if this can happen when you're below deck, right? Because even if you have this visual information, like you're still aligned with the doors, but everything is moving, and this sensory conflict is something that can cause motion sickness. All right, and that's why they tell you to go outside, look at the horizon, have a reference that's actually a good one for vertical and gravity. Okay, so this multi-sensory integration is very critical for balance control, and it's highly flexible. So if I'm standing on a boat, or if I'm in a whiteout, you may at different times use different combinations of sensory information for balance control, and your brain basically takes in all that information and has to decide which ones are reliable, and then sort of make a decision on which way am I falling and what do I need to do. And so you're shifting all the time between these, and that's a sign of a healthy brain. If you lose one of those, then now you might be sort of overly more reliant on some of the other senses. If people have diabetic neuropathy or something, or losing sensation in the feet, they can compensate with these other sensors to an extent. Okay. All right. Any questions so far? Okay. So in our lab, why do we care about this sensation? You need to know which way you're falling in order to move. So we have started to study perceptual control of whole body motion in the platform that I showed you. And this is a psychophysical experiment where we have people standing on the platform, we move them directly backwards, and then 5 seconds later, After they've stabilized again, we perturb them backwards and to the side by some number of degrees. So like 3 degrees, 15 degrees, something like that. And then we ask them to make a judgment about those two perturbations of whether or not they're in the same direction or in different directions. And typically this is done in sensory experiments where there's like, touching your finger or showing you a stimulus and there's no motor action. Here the person has actually successfully maintained their balance both times, and then they're going to tell us if these are in the same or different directions. And we want to find what's called a perceptual threshold. So that's the point at which they're saying same and different at 50% of the time. So that's the line at which, if you have a larger difference, they're going to be more likely to say that they're different. And if you have a smaller one, they're more likely to say that they're the same. And we can build a psychrometric curve. I didn't put it in here. So in young adults, we see a threshold of about here at 9.5 degrees. That increases in older adults, and it increases even further in people with Parkinson's disease, as well as stroke. So that means that in this case, in young adults, we can anywhere from 5 to 12 degrees is about what we see. And it means that people with Parkinson's basically often don't know that they're falling sort of backwards and to the left. So if you're trying to use a voluntary strategy to correct your balance, you may not have the right information that you need to do that. So it may, in a study that we did, we showed that the poor whole body perception is actually related to sort of balance deficits. So it may not be related to inability to activate muscles, but simply to know how to do it. So in this case, on the x-axis, we have perceptual threshold that ranges from about 12 all the way up to 30 degrees. So that means I did a perturbation out to here and they thought it felt the same as one that was directly backwards. And in stroke, we've now seen out to like 50 degrees, which is crazy. So on the y-axis, I have what's called a mini-best score. This is a clinical test of balance. It has many different parts and it gets rated. And so the lower the score, your worse your balance, and it tops out at 28 here. So in older adults, we did find differences in perceptual thresholds ranging out to about 20 degrees, but there was no correlation with their clinical balance score. Whereas in people with Parkinson's disease, and I think this is playing out in stroke as well, we see this pretty strong correlation to their inability to actually perceive their body motion. So it begs the question of whether these balance deficits are actually motor deficits or not.
Have you, like, you or any other groups been able to tease out which of the different components of the multi-sensory integration system are contributing to this? Or is it everything?
We are not able to do this. We blindfold people, so we are getting rid of vision. But there have been all sorts of sort of sensory deficits that have been identified in Parkinson's disease, but not very many studies on it. So another thing is there's a study where people walk on a split treadmill and they change the velocity between the two. And you have to say, you hit a button when you're like, oh yeah, they're different. And then that, people with Parkinson's, they have to be almost in phase before they will detect the difference. Whereas like healthy young adults are very, very sensitive to differences in phase. So that would probably be more of a proprioceptive one, right? But there's visual processing deficits. There's all sorts of sensory deficits.
So, Lena, I have a question about this line of research. Have you, or has your group looked at, instead of comparing two different perturbations, just looking at the threshold for detection of perturbation or not? So
no, we haven't. We tried, but it's very difficult to do with the motor systems that we have to reliably deliver the very small perturbations. So because we are so sensitive, so there's a little stiction, There's also this parameter like redundancy. So what's bigger or smaller, you have displacement, velocity, or acceleration that we can all sense. And so there's lots of different combinations, and like keeping all those sort of scaled is difficult, and then we don't actually know which sort of sensor it is. So we originally tried to do that, and we've tried on two different machines, in the arm and the leg, and it's just not reliable.
Thanks.
So one of the things we were looking at is like, okay, what's happening in your brain to do this? And so when we record brain activity, we were looking at sort of brain activity just prior to those perturbations. And so you get electrical signals from the brain, and they're categorized in different frequency ranges. And they just have Greek letter names, for lack of imagination, or some other system of categorization. I'm going to show you things in the beta range, which is typically thought of as a sensory motor signal, and there isn't any rhyme or reason as to why it's called that, but it is there sort of based on empirical measures demonstrating like the appearance of these types of oscillations during sensory motor tasks. So one of the questions we asked is, why do people have different perceptual thresholds, and can we explain that? It may not be the fact that they're like sensors in the periphery have any problems. This could be a central processing problem. So here we have our same experiment, and this is a sort of spectrogram where I have time on the x-axis, and so my perturbation happens in the pink dotted line, and then this red thing is sort of the response to the perturbation. And what we were doing is looking before the perturbation, when they're just standing there, what's the level of activity in the beta range? So basically this is like 13 to 30 hertz, and the color here, blue, indicates that there's not much going on, right? And in this other individual that has a higher perceptual threshold, so that means worse perception, they have a lot more power in the beta range beforehand. And the beta oscillations are like there. If you hold a funny posture, you'll have a higher beta. People with Parkinson's disease have higher beta, just pathologically. And so what we found, incredibly, is this strong relationship between the perceptual threshold of each individual and the amount of beta power in a particular part of their brain, which I'll talk about later, just before that perturbation. And so now people are thinking about, so lots of beta power, so beta as gating sensory information to the brain. So it's, people who can't detect until 10 degrees are, we think, centrally in their brain is saying, don't pay attention to this information, right? So back to the Parkinson's disease story, we haven't published this yet, but we have looked at, we're now collecting data to see if we can get the same thing, but in a different analysis of data. We looked at beta power as they were standing, not while they're doing a perceptual task. And that was also correlated with their balance score. So this suggests, that they just have elevated beta all the time, and that contributes to their sensory perception impairments, which then contributes to their balance impairments, would be the conjecture there. Not showing it here, but beta fluctuates over time, just there's a little burst of it. And so we did show, even on a trial by trial basis, when beta appears, you're less likely to detect the difference between the two stimuli. And that was also shown in a discrimination task in haptic and visual, like other sort of more standard sensory perception tasks.
Dr. Ting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have information about the young adults, for example, what was their activities that they do in their daily lives, to maybe see if that could be influencing the way their brains are given like this different.
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't do it in this cohort. Although I'll show some other data on other brain activity where we did look at that. But this is definitely right. And as I said, like beta may be more active, people are co-activating. So it could be people who are less confident in what they're doing or scared. We see a lot of co-activation in older adults that may be related to some increased beta oscillations in the brain.
Okay, thank you.
We also have a question in the chat from Emma. Does Parkinson's alter other brain waves besides the beta wave?
I mean, it alters a lot of things. So beta, there's, I don't know about the I'm not an expert on all of these, and it also depends on the different areas of the brain in which the beta oscillations are increased. Well, we're looking at the supplementary motor area, which we can talk about, and it's also emanating from deep in the brain. That's the canonical one that people talk about. I've seen other ranges, gamma, which is like high frequency local processing. But if you look for a deficit in Parkinson's, you could probably find it anywhere.
One more thing about the activity. In this study, I just happened to know that there were 2 dancers
Okay.
in the young adult study, and they didn't have super good or bad thresholds, but the like psychometric curve of their threshold was super sharp. So like if you went a little bit over the threshold, they would always say same, and if you went a little bit below, they would always say different or whatever.
So when they make that choice, you're saying they're much more confident in that choice. If you have a psychometric curve that's very steep.
Yeah, there was less like times where they would say different answers in response to the same angle once you get close to the threshold.
Okay.
So like perceptual acuity or something was high, even though their threshold was just average.
I think we call it sensitivity. Acuity is like the threshold, and sensitivity is the slope.
Oh, yeah.
Changes. Yep.
Oh, it's kind of interesting.
Thanks, Kennedy. Okay, so takes a lot of senses, and then we're gonna talk about coordinating muscles. I gotta keep going. So there are many, now you gotta know you're falling, which way you're falling. There are many different muscle coordination patterns you can use for a backward perturbation. You can do an ankle strategy, a hip strategy. You can use different muscles depending on your posture or what you're holding on to. And then a whole nother strategy if you're gonna take a step or grab onto something. So again, there's no singular relationship between like I'm falling in a particular direction and I wanna activate a particular set of muscles. And this is where now we can start to look at the, I don't know how to stop this video. Oh, you guys made me a GIF. Okay, that's why. So it's distracting though. Okay, so when we look at these systems involved in balance, like there are 3 different ones here, but they're all kind of doing different things and at different delays. So when we look at the spinal cord signal, we're looking at joint level sort of muscle and reflex feedback. So I would call this a postural controller and not a balance controller. Okay, the spinal cord and just proprioception. It's only one sensory modality. When we move to the brainstem, we move to what I call task level control of actually which way you're falling. And then when we move to the brain, like sort of think about it's more like assessing, okay, is this working and what should I do about it? Should I change my strategy? And that's even slower. So when we look at the contributions to this muscle response, the early part, actually about 50 milliseconds, you would see a spinal response. We don't see it here. Then a brainstem response, and then a cortical response. And of course, knowing everything out here would be a combination of all of that. Because it takes, we're watching things kick in. That's another issue with the locomotion is that it's hard to know when things are kicking in. So balance, so postural control, like instantaneously when you have muscle coactivation, you can have sort of stiffening of the joint. that gets reinforced by the spinal reflex response, right? Which then all maintains a joint position, so that's like the standing in the boat. And then at the brainstem level, you integrate that, and then you can make this decision. So just to reinforce this difference, when I translate the platform backwards, I stretch my calf muscle, and then it causes both instantaneous stiffness response and a reflex response that will like contract it. My body will pitch forward, so the center of mass is moving forward, and I would activate it even more to maintain balance. But if I now tilt the platform here, I'll stretch the calf muscle, but my body will be falling backwards, and so if I continue to activate that calf muscle, I will throw myself down backwards. And so what happens is that muscle then shuts off, and then the antagonist muscle, the tibialis anterior, will activate. And so this is where you see a switch between a postural controller and a balance controller. So, if you're just relying on co-contraction and stretch reflexes, that's not very useful when the floor tilts. And, we do see more co-contraction in older adults and less co-contraction in dancers, say. The stiffening is a postural strategy and not a balance strategy.
Lena, has this been done in different body configurations, like standing versus a squat?
I don't know.
Okay. Just wondering how that configuration may give option.
I've done it in cats on 4 legs, and it's the same. So we see the same principles in quadrupedal stance. Okay, so when you like, if that all fails, you go to your cortical input, and it's like, oh, I'm going to change my strategy. I'm going to change to a stepping strategy. I'm going to, reach for something. And what's important in driving this response is sort of the direction of your body and not of the joints. And the joints can move in all different ways, and that's what we showed in cats. Is like the joints could be like moving in completely opposite directions, but your brain needs to tell you which way you're falling. And then some of you may have heard of muscle synergies, and these sort of are recruited based on the direction of falling across multiple types of these strategies. So I may have a strategy for pushing to the left or pushing to the right, and that can hold regardless of sort of what kind of motor strategy I'm trying to accomplish. Okay, so we noticed that when we had expert dancers walking across a beam versus novices walking across a beam, that they were using similar muscle synergies in this brainstem mediated time window of reactive balance as when they're walking on the ground and walking on a beam. So they were, experts could walk further. These are ballet dancers, and they were using shared modules. So that means sort of the same motor patterns for walking on a beam, reactive balance, and walking on the ground. So that would suggest they're using this automatic portion of their brain because it's the same motor patterns. And then the novices, they start to separate. And in fact, when people with stroke on their control leg, or sort of on their, these are controls, people with stroke also have a reduced sort of more sharing of modules across different tasks when they have better performance or walking speed. So here's the idea, is that as long as my motor control remains automatic in the brainstem, that would be a better motor pattern than the cortically controlled one, which I already said was sort of voluntary and you don't want to rely on it all the time. Okay, so this is sort of circumstantial evidence, and that led us to, let's skip over that, led us to then say, well, we can't really say where these muscle patterns are coming from. We should just measure from the brain directly. And so that's when we started to measure from the brain, because although we know that the brain is being used, the measures of that are all observational, like people can't walk and talk at the same time. And that's an indicator of people, having fall risk. And then a really common clinical test of this is timed up and go, where people like get up from a chair, walk around a cone, and then what you do is you have them, and then come back and sit down, you time them, and then you have them do it while they're also counting backwards by threes. And then what happens is that they may slow down if they're already using these cortical resources for walking, and they have to now have a divided attention to do both the walking task and the counting task. But the score is just like how many seconds longer did it take. So that was sort of not satisfactory for us. We want to actually see what circuits are being used as they're doing this. And so when we add brain activity to this task, here's a movie of the voltage on the top of the brain during this perturbation. So you can see a really salient response, and it's sort of centered at the middle of the brain. And we can then start to look at that signal. All right, I'm gonna quit that one. So what we see is that as we increase the size of the perturbation, even in a young adult, you see increased activity in the brain. So that makes sense, right? It gets more difficult. Then we switch to an older adult. This is actually an older gentleman with Parkinson's disease. You can see we give a very small perturbation, and even at the very small perturbations, you start to see brain activity involved, right? And that increases as they go up. And so we had to give smaller perturbations here. So we can also just look at one electrode at the top of the brain and look at its response. And this is a negative deflection in voltage of 50 microvolts, which is really huge for an EEG signal. It's localized in what's called the supplementary motor area, which is sort of between your premotor and your motor cortex, sort of in the front. So it's involved in like sequence motor planning and things like that. So this negative deflection of the brain is called an N1 potential. And it's been known since the 80s, but it's smaller. It's what we think of as a balance error assessment signal that really tells me like how bad is this event for me. So if I'm distracted, I'm not paying attention, it'll be smaller. If I'm surprised, it's bigger. If people have fear of falling, it's bigger. And so we think about this as like a combination between like my own sort of cognitive assessment of myself and my motor ability and the actual task difficulty, which we're calling balanced challenge, right? So as you saw before, like a really small perturbation could be challenging to an older adult. And so that's the intersection of the sort of objective difficulty of the task and then something about that individual. And so the size of this N1 potential we're hypothesizing kind of tells me that challenge level. And so in young adults, what we saw is that people who, if they're standing on a platform, they have different amplitudes of this response. And this is like a really huge one, over 100 microvolts. And the people with the really large responses of this N1 response, which is related to like what's called a cognitive error-related negativity when people make mistakes. It's also referred to as the oh shit response. So that's those people are the ones who could not walk as far across this beam. And the people who had a smaller response in their brain were the people who could walk further along this beam. So we were able to demonstrate, in fact, that this is why we think that this N1 response really indicates the level of challenge posed by the same perturbation to a group of individuals, differentially, right? And in older adults, we didn't have the beam test, so the mini best score was not great, but the amplitude was related to balance confidence. The more confident they were, the less of a brain signal there was. And that's just like a questionnaire. And then that's supposed to come up. The surprising thing, now we bring in the cognitive stuff, is that their amplitude was larger if they had poor, what we call cognitive set shifting. And I'll explain what that is, but it's an executive function of the brain. So again, there's two different sort of tasks, and the slower they are, the bigger that amplitude. So it's very strange that like a brain evoked potential during standing would have anything to do with the cognitive task, except this cognitive task of set shifting is actually associated with falls in older adults and in people with Parkinson's disease. So I see, I put this in a different place. I'm going to skip that for now and talk about how this signal might be a way to kind of identify people who have less automatic control of balance, even if they don't have any problems on a clinical test, and that it might help identify this idea of a challenge point for training, right? So if you have, here's the idea is that when you want to train people, then you want to give them a task, like how do you pick the right difficulty, right? You don't want to give people a task that is so hard that they fail all the time. So that's in these beginners, but that same task for an expert might be pretty easy. And so they're not going to learn. So you want people to learn right as they're on this curve between it being too hard and too easy. And or potentially that N1 response could give you an index of that, as we're seeing that it scales with an individual's ability to do a related task. Okay, so you could then maybe evaluate intervention effects, or look at assistive devices and things like that. So this is one of the ways we're thinking about stratifying individual differences in sort of balance control that might be difficult to measure otherwise. Okay, how much time do I have left?
Got about 30 minutes.
Oh, okay, great. So, in support of that, we recently had a paper showing that like this N1 response is quite reliable over time. So that's really important when you have a measure that's characterizing something, that measure is stable over time, right? So here we have tested people a week apart on 2 different days, and then in some cases for older adults, a year apart, just because we happen to recruit the same people. And so on average, things look pretty similar at those different time points for this potential. And on the right is what you're seeing is each set of lines here represents a different individual. And so you can see that the shapes of these brain potentials look very similar across different time points that even span out to a year. And in some cases, they may have changed some within a year. And that's where we might look for, whether there was a fall, or hopefully it could go the other way too, if they had a successful sort of rehabilitation intervention to improve their balance. Okay, so we did that. Okay. Any questions so far? Because I'm going to go into one last piece. All right. Nothing in the chat. Okay, so I mentioned this idea that like cognitive and motor functions are related. And this was not something we intended to study, but it definitely happened because of that result that we showed you. And so let me just talk about what this cognitive function is of set shifting that we've been using a lot. So cognitive set shifting is really the ability to change your behavior based on like a changing set of rules. And so clinically, the way you do it is you do what's called a trail making test, in which there's a piece of paper and there are a bunch of letters and numbers, and you have to connect them in order. So in part A of the test, you are connecting the dots between the numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there are only numbers on the page. And then in part B, there are numbers and letters, and what you need to do is alternate between the numbers and letters, 1A, 2B, 3C. And again, like this clinical test, you just measure how much time it takes for people to complete the task. And because there's the same number of targets, it sort of controls for like slowness of movement. So any additional, because they're connecting the same number of targets with the same distance, then any additional time it takes to do part B is attributed to this idea of cognitive set shifting, that I have to be like switching, like, oh, now I have to go to a letter, now I have to go to a number. So this cognitive set shifting, like, why is this related to falls? Like, so it's this sort of behavioral flexibility isn't something that's just limited to cognitive tasks, but it's also necessary for motor tasks, right? So like I showed you, like the way in which we activate our muscles to balance depends on lots of things. If I'm on my hands and knees, if I'm holding a cane or not, right? And so this idea of motor set shifting can also be a problem for being able to appropriately move in the world. So this is an experiment done by Faye Horak, where people, again, were just standing on a platform, they perturb them, the posterior chain of muscles is activated in response, and then they immediately put people in a chair, and then they did the same backward perturbation. And in this case, you can see the abdominal muscles are activated and then the leg muscles are inactivated. That makes sense. That's like I changed the rules of my biomechanics and then I changed the activity appropriately. Now, people with Parkinson's disease have problems in cognitive set shifting, and it looks like that also extends to what I would call motor set shifting. So on the left is the same person with Parkinson's. Now they do tend to activate both the sort of posterior chain and then the front muscles sort of in this alternating pattern. They tend to oscillate a bit and have more coactivation. But so that's abnormal. But when you put them in a seated position, you can see that you maintain those timings of the muscles, and the leg muscles are not attenuated. So they're still activating these muscles in the legs, even though they're not participating in restoring their seated balance, right? So if you think about what the implications could be for falling, right? Let's say you're walking around and you are switching from a carpet surface to a tile surface, and you fail to account for that in your motor plan, that could lead to a fall. So there are many cases, our environments outside are constantly changing, my body posture is constantly changing, and if I fail to update my motor plan for that, I may fail in that task. So again, like the falling in Parkinson's disease, some of it could be to this poor motor output, but some of it could be just inability to actually alter that motor output for the situation that I'm in.
Quick question. In this study, did they do upright and then seated all the time, or was order switched?
So they typically, for these types of experiments, you see in order to see these changes, you have to go from the more difficult task to the easier task, right? If you go from the easier task to the more difficult task, you typically get immediate feedback to kind of change them. So there are similar experiments with sensory information where it's like they give you this moving environment and then they take it away and you continue to act as if, you know, that's happening in a easier condition where it actually doesn't matter, right? So there's no negative consequence of actually having your legs activated here, right? So there's no feedback showing you that like, oh, I should turn it off.
Got it.
And so that makes it a really nice way to see that it's happening. It would have to be, you'd probably see it if you went the other way, but you'd have to do an experiment like I did and just look at like, you know, a matter of milliseconds before the feedback loop would come back on and say like, hey, that's a bad thing to do.
Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, so this is a probe of like, what is the nervous system kind of estimating, and then in a feed forward sense, before like
So,
the feedback.
yeah, I do have a question. So I don't, and this might be a stupid question, you know,
They're not
but there might be right now. No, I'm just kidding. But I don't know much about Parkinson's disease, right? Because I don't do a lot of it. Is it only the feed forward that's affected, or is there some feedback in the system like muscle spindles or proprioception that is also altered?
I mean, the receptors themselves don't seem to be altered, except in the fact that they might be like overactive because there's motor drive to them.
Mhm.
But like when we look at it, and I didn't show our data, it's like, it doesn't look that different than healthy people. It's just that it's on both directions, but it's very closely time locked to the proprioceptive sensory information. So we don't think it's a loss of sensory information. We can like reproduce every little blip based on their center of mass, acceleration, velocity, and position. So it's the same circuit. It's just sort of, you know, in the same way that they can't figure out standing from seated, it's also that maybe they don't know forward from backward. Actually, I have another slide on that coming up. So set shifting is also, you know, impaired in older adults and in a bunch of other sort of diseases, neurological disorders.
Cool, thank you.
All right, that came out wrong. Okay, so so we also showed in older adults this time that these individual variations of what we're calling cognitive stiffness or cognitive inflexibility is actually associated with their motor stiffness. So on the left is the center of mass displacement, like how far the body moved forwards or backwards. And we gave like 3 different amplitudes of perturbation in both directions, anterior and posterior. And you can see these individual differences here too. So on the left, someone who moves a lot and someone who doesn't move very much. Now we definitely have arguments about what's better, somebody who moves less after perturbation or somebody who moves more. Any comments on that? Who do you think has better balance?
We have arguments like this a lot too.
It's always better in what sense? Better for what purpose?
Balance.
Time to? Deviation? I mean, there's lots of
I mean,
pieces of that.
if the looser person doesn't fall, then it seems like it's fine, right?
No harm, no foul. Yeah.
Right. So any other, how about a vote, a show of hands for the person on the right having better balance? I can't actually see if anyone actually raised their hand virtually or in reality. And then how many of you say the person on the left has better balance? Okay, great. More left than right. So great. So one of the things we did is let's say we take the amplitudes of how much they moved and then relate it to their trail making test. So this is a trail making test where this person out here took 80 seconds longer to connect the dots when they had to alternate between letters and numbers than just connect them. And that person's center of mass moved the least. So that's this person here, right? So this is across all amplitudes. We only have to look at one of these lines. So, and then the person who did it in like an additional, say, 20 seconds, their center of mass moved the most. Okay, so the sway is not necessarily, well, we don't know. Well, it turns out if you now look at their muscle activity when they're perturbed, there are more muscles co-activated on the person on the right. And what did I tell you about co-activation? It's a postural strategy, not a balance strategy. So we can look at one muscle, and this is the way we do it. So the muscle, this is a tibialis anterior, and in a forward perturbation, you need to turn it on to as an agonist. So that's indicated here in purple, and for the person on the left, and on the right, and purple for the person here is purple. So that's when it's supposed to be on. When we perturb them in the backward direction, you want to shut that muscle off, otherwise it's fighting the gastrocs or the calf muscles. And so this person, you can see they're turning their tibialis anterior on in the forward direction and off in the backward direction. And then this other person who's very stiff, they're turning it on in the forward direction. And you can see that in this first brainstem time window, it's actually still off in the backward perturbation. However, in this later time bin, which we think is when the cortical control can kick in, it's turned on to the same or greater extent than it is when it's being an agonist. So this is this idea of like, I don't know which way I'm falling, or like we didn't test their perceptual acuity here, but maybe they don't know which, they can't distinguish forward and backward, and so the answer is just to turn on all your muscles. And so we see an extreme version of that in Parkinson's disease. But here, like these are older adults with no overt cognitive or motor deficits. In many cases, their cognitive scores were fine, and it was just this one element of that test that was impaired. And we see this coactivation of muscles. So maybe it's like, I don't know which way I'm falling, I don't know how to tune my, change my strategy of balancing based on the direction of movement. Okay. And then, so that's next one. Any more questions on this one?
I have a question on on this slide. So on the figure on the right, the biggest effect seems to be the different colors. What are the different colors?
The colors here are just the different sizes of perturbation we gave.
Okay.
So we got a big one, smaller and smaller. So these are basically all the same idea. We can just look at the black one for the largest effect on this largest perturbation here.
Yeah. And so in this task, what's the instruction to the participant?
We just tell them to stand and maintain their balance. We don't give them.
Yeah, I guess, to your question about who's sort of better, and maybe this is what others were suggesting, like to me, it depends a lot on how we describe better, because some people might describe better as returning back to your original state the quickest.
Yep. Sorry, let me get back. That's right. And you can see here that a lot of people here, they don't actually come back, right? So that's not necessarily a priority. We often don't see people coming all the way back because you basically have to get yourself back into the base of support, and then it's kind of good enough. So we don't tell them they have to go back to their initial posture, that's for sure. And they're doing it many times. So there may be an element of like, I know this is going to happen a whole bunch of times, so I have to adopt a strategy so I can finish this experiment. But those strategies can change a lot depending on like the order that we present perturbations and things like that. So you can play around with randomization or predictable things, and these will definitely change.
And would you expect, so I think, because you all have also done studies looking at the threshold at which people take a step. Mm-hmm. So like, would you imagine that there are differences between the looser versus stiffer individuals in terms of when they need to take a step like that?
Yeah, absolutely. If you do this strategy, you're going to fall like a tree.
Okay. Yeah. So I think with that information, then it'd be like, yo, that person's definitely has poorer balance because they have less of an ability to stay within their base of support without.
Yeah. So from like an engineering perspective, you would say, oh, they've returned faster, so their like
Yeah.
time constant is better.
Right.
But from that's only if we assume that that behavior persists across all perturbation sizes,
Right. Mhm.
and that we basically have a linear system. So, but we don't, and so this we have to think about robustness, which is how large of a perturbation can I handle, and in this case, the people who do this, I don't know if you remember the other video, we gave like a tiny perturbation, and they're moving very stiffly and quickly. That's not.
Yeah.
And the specific retropulsion test or reactive balance test that you can give, and you can see when people take a step, or we can do it with our platform.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are a lot of papers that look at that recovery time as the measure of the goodness of someone's balance. So
yeah, I don't think it's a good measure. I mean, and sometimes it can be because people can't generate enough torque. So that's been shown in older adults, but like it could just be that they're coactivating, and if they shut off one muscle, it wouldn't be so bad. Right? If they knew which way to activate their muscle.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the last data slide I think I have is that, back to this brain potential. This brain potential in younger adults and older adults in stroke, it does get smaller, but that we don't know, that may be due to shrinking brains, so we can't really compare the amplitude across these different populations. But what we can do is compare the amplitude of these perturbations during that experiment where there is one perturbation that's happens like every 30 seconds to a minute, and another perturbation that happens exactly 5 seconds after the other one. So one is sort of less predictable in time, and the other one is very precisely predictable in time. And so the darker ones here are the first perturbation response in the brain, and the second one is the response to the second perturbation. So it's like, oh, I have a first perturbation. I know that there's going to be one coming up in 5 seconds, and so it's sort of less surprising to me, right? I'm anticipating it. So this is the balance error assessment of like, I'm expecting it, I can handle it. So we see this modulation between the first perturbation and the second perturbation, and in younger adults, it's always smaller in the second. You see that in older adults, and it's starting to flatten out, and then sort of less of a modulation in stroke. And we're collecting the data now in Parkinson's disease, as I said, and it's like sometimes it's just completely flat. Like every perturbation is as surprising as the last, regardless of what, how predictable that is. So they have, again, this is just another indication of behavioral inflexibility, the inability to modify their neural response to the context in which it's happening. Oops. I didn't put the slides here, but they get like 100 perturbations, and in young adults, the pairs will then decrease. Same thing in older adults. And in some cases, people with stroke or Parkinson's disease are just flatline. The first one has the same amplitude as the 100th one. And so there's like no adaptation to that sort of very predictable set of conditions. So, all right, so yes, so this balance impairments could be related to inflexibility in our repertoire, and our ability to account for the situation and modify our output. And so, the overall idea is that your brain has multiple sensory and planning functions that affect balance, and that you could use to maybe probe balance health because of these sort of intersection things. It's very hard to think about balance as just a motor function. And these changes, when we measure the brain, might help us measure kind of compensatory changes that precede any overt measurable balance impairments, even though these things are happening, and can stratify individuals. based on sort of what I call balance health. And then what we're trying to do now is then now look even deeper, not just at this one brain potential, but the different neural circuits that are engaged to see sort of different processes in the brain that could be contributing to those balance impairments. Okay, that's the end of the talk. So you're supposed to give feedback here.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Trainees?
I could stop sharing if I could figure out how to do it.
Okay, I have a question, Lena. So for those of us who don't have EEG systems, if we wanted to make some measurements that kind of assess people's cognitive flexibility, but we want to do a limited set of additional things, what are the best tools to use to measure that?
It depends on what population you're looking at, right?
Okay.
You know, at least in the older adults, even with the pen and paper test, we get it, right? We get a difference. I don't know how sensitive that would be for like healthy young adults. I don't know. Katie and Iran are here. You can tell us what that should be.
Yes, hello.
Hey.
You mean like the different types of dual tasking things? I mean,
What kind
there's
of-
like timed up and go.
No, what kind of
Yeah.
what kind of set shifting task would be sensitive to variations across, let's say, young adults?
We just want any kind of like either survey or task that doesn't take too long that we could add to a protocol to sort of assess this in our participants as one of the things that might explain individual variation.
For young adults, I know trails is a big one, like trails A and B. And Iran probably knows even more about that than I do, but I know it's used a lot more with older adults. Young adults, it's really hard to get those differences because it's really hard to challenge them in a hard way. I guess, yeah, I mean, there's balance like in cognitive dual tasking. If you make those hard enough, you can do that as well. But I don't know. Iran, help me out. Do you know ones for young adults specifically?
I don't know if she's.
Are there differences if you like recruited experienced athletes and dancers versus sedentary young adults that you could measure differences in?
So, I mean, definitely the beam whacking task is there for balance, but that's like all the things put together. And then I'm guessing there's probably some type of computerized task in which things start coming at you faster and faster. And you have to like make a decision, right?
Yes. Yeah. There are things like, I know the NBAC task, which is what I do in my experiment, you can actually change the timing and the number of letters. So you have to like press the button when you see a letter that's the same as the one shown to before it in the two back, or if you can increase like the number of letters in between that you'd have to remember what the target was. And so you can do a 3 back or God forbid a 4 back, which I think people would hate. But you can also increase the time, like the amount of time that.
But Katie, that's not necessarily a set shifting task, though, right?
Yeah, right. Or combined with something else, it could be, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We could maybe think about what kind of tests could be done. But in the first one, we give everyone the paper and pencil test for trail making.
Right.
And it's easy to administer. But Iran's designing a new task that's like a computer task where you do stuff and you like hit buttons. There are various versions of that you could potentially give, or yeah.
How long do they take?
Yeah.
That, but I don't know, a couple minutes.
Okay. Cool.
Yep.
All right. Any other questions before we wrap up? discussion points? All right.
Everyone have a good holiday weekend. Thanks for coming.
Everybody enjoy your 4th of July.
Thanks, Lena.
Thanks for this, Lena. It's really helpful.